Thank you and welcome everyone who's joined our webinar. Our webinar tonight is based on Food and Water Watch's recent report, The Fracking Endgame, Locked into Plastics, Pollution, and Climate Chaos. This new report is the one of its kind, to detail the extent to which the oil and gas industry, the petrochemical industry, the export sector, and the electric power industry in the US are building out frack gas infrastructure. Currently, they're faced with a gas glut, and frackers are banking on this large-scale infrastructure build-out to absorb the surplus gas supply so there can be continued drilling and gas production through the manufacture of new products like plastics, new markets, exports, and new end users, such as petrochemical and gas power plants. Tonight, we're going to hear from a few speakers about the current state of our fracking industry and how this oversupply of unprofitable fracked gas is propelling hundreds of polluting infrastructure projects, and how you, listening in, can help stop the planned infrastructure expansion of these facilities to protect our climate and our planet. I'm Allison Grass, the Research Director with Food and Water Watch, Food and Water Action, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. So thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our allies and our partners who have circulated this webinar with their networks. And thanks so much to the speakers here with us that are participating in this timely webinar. Before we get started, I'm going to give you a quick orientation of Zoom, which is the platform that most of you on the computer are using. This would be a good time to mention that if you have not already joined us on the screen share, we highly recommend doing that by clicking the link that was given to you in your email. We're here on video, and we're going to be sharing slides at some point in the webinar, so it'll be useful to join. We'll be keeping everyone on mute to cut down on background noise, but we will be taking questions throughout. We have the raise hand feature and the chat feature disabled. However, you can ask questions during any point of the presentation by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can throughout the entire webinar. If you have any technical issues, and if you're joining us by phone, feel free to email any questions to act@fwwatch.org. And with that, let's get started with our program. In a time when we need to be moving away from fossil fuels like fracked gas to stave off the worst effects of climate change, the gas industry is investing in a mammoth infrastructure build-out that would encourage continued drilling. In our new report, The Fracking Endgame, Locked into Plastics, Pollution, and Climate Chaos, we spell out how frackers are angling to double down and lock the world into their polluting investments. Faced with a gas glut, the proposed infrastructure projects stand to serve as an economic lifeline to the struggling industry. Frackers are producing more gas than can be used. The supply greatly exceeds demand. And this economic disconnect is bad for their business. But fracking has been an even bigger environmental disaster to communities and the planet. Without the build out of frack gas infrastructure, the fracking industry would likely face more severe economic headwinds, and it'll be difficult to continue drilling and doing exploration projects. But we know the United States needs to shift to 100% clean renewable energy rapidly to stave off the worst effects of climate change. The fossil fuel infrastructure that is currently planned and is under construction will have an effective lifespan for longer than the point when experts agree that we need to shed all fossil fuels. But the fracking industry's polluting partnership with the triple threat of the gas exporters, plastics industry, and power companies is buttressing the climate-destroying expansion of fracking in the United States. These proposals and plans also underpin why infrastructure site bites play such a crucial role in derailing polluting partnerships and saving our planet from climate change. So now I'd like to make some introductions, give you bios of our speakers here, and then after that, we'll get to our panelists. So tonight joining us, we have Sandra Steingraber. She is a biologist, author, and a cancer survivor who writes about climate change, ecology, and the links between human health and the environment. Her highly acclaimed book, Living Downstream, an ecologist's personal investigation of cancer and the environment, was the first to bring together data on toxic releases with data from US cancer registries and was adapted for the screen in 2010. Contributing essayist and editor for Orion Magazine, Sandra is currently a distinguished scholar and resident at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York. Oakley Shelton Thomas. He is a researcher with Food and Water Watch. He works to expose the ways in which corporate power influences and corrupts decision-making and conducts research on climate and energy issues. Andrea Chu. She is a regional organizer with Food and Water Watch, working to build power in the Midwest and fighting for climate justice and clean air and water. And our last speaker will be Matt Smith. He is a senior organizer with Food and Water Watch in New Jersey and is responsible for developing and implementing legislative, field organizing, and media strategies and campaigns in support of Food and Water Watch's policy goals. Now, I've only summarized a very brief amount of some of the incredible work our speakers have done. But with that, I'm going to kick it off to our first speaker and let Sandra Steingraber get us going.
Well, thanks a lot. It's a real honor to be part of this whole gathering tonight. This report is not only one of the most important environmental reports that I've ever seen, but it touches on, I think, the defining issue of our time right now. And that is that we are in the middle of a climate crisis, and it's really fracking and oil and gas that is now driving that crisis. We have a very tight timeline to turn all this around. Fracking itself is not a money-making operation. It runs on Wall Street debt. Its financial fundamentals are very unstable, and yet through gas-fired power plants, through liquefied natural gas export terminals, and by turning a waste product from fracking, namely another hydrocarbon gas called ethane, into the building block for plastics, this is tossing the fossil fuel industry a lifeline at the very moment when we should be issuing a do not resuscitation order. So how this plays out in the years ahead, it's like it's hard to overstate the stakes here. The whole fate of human civilization, our children's future, species extinctions, all depend on how this is going to play out. So in just a couple minutes, I want to put a kind of finer point on some of the themes that you heard that we're going to explore tonight. And I'm speaking now out of my identity as the co-founder of Concerned Health Professionals of New York. We have released a report of our own on the health and climate impacts of fracking, called the Compendium of Scientific, Medical, and Media Evidence Demonstrating the Risks and Harms of Fracking Findings. And so this can be found on our website, concernedhealthny.org. So in that front matter, we talk specifically about this collision course that fracking is on with our future, pointing out that the fracking boom and its protracted deregulation are at odds with the emerging scientific consensus on the scale and tempo of necessary climate change mitigation, and with raising public alarm about the impending crisis that this consensus has amplified. And in October 2018, in its first commissioned report under the Paris Agreement, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change announced that emissions from oil and gas must swiftly decline within the next decade. And that is a trend not compatible with further build out of oil and gas infrastructure. Specifically, the IPCC found that global warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius is likely to result in irreversible points of no return and cascading uncontrollable harms, including whole-scale loss of coral reefs, loss of ocean fish stocks, widespread crop failure, flooding of coastal cities, multiple public health crises, and social disruption. And to avoid the worst of these outcomes, the world needs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And at the same time, the ongoing fracking boom is also on a collision course with trends in economics of renewable energy. The ongoing build out of natural gas pipelines has been accompanied by an ongoing wave of natural gas power plant construction here in the United States. And yet, a new analysis shows that 100% renewable energy systems in the United States would actually reduce electricity costs, and renewables are already replacing existing gas plants in some cases. And with this economic lifespan between 30 and 50 years, new oil and gas infrastructure projects are now at risk for becoming stranded assets. But if this White House policy of energy dominance continues to dominate our public lives, then the renewable energy won't just kind of naturally take over, right? Because we have a flattening domestic demand for gas, but the ongoing fracking boom is increasingly directed at export markets. The US is now on track to become the world's largest international seller of natural gas. And as of now, 3 natural gas LNG export terminals are operational, with more than a dozen LNG terminals in the planning or development stage, as you're going to hear. And at the same time, we have all these petrochemical and plastics connections being made, with pipelines already taking the waste products from fracking ethane into a pipeline, taking it all the way across the state of Pennsylvania over to Scotland to be turned into plastics, and with a larger plan of turning all of Appalachia into a giant ethylene cracker. So we were going to get millions of more plastic bags, whether we demand them or not. And essentially, we're at and this is my final point, we're at a moment where we are blasting fossilized marine organisms out of the ground. These are Devonian creatures whose bodies are now bubbles of methane, ethane, propane, and butane. We are blasting dead marine animals out of the ground, turning them into plastics, which are then killing all the current marine organisms in our ocean and swinging a wrecking ball at our climate. And so the stakes couldn't be higher. And I'm just absolutely thrilled that we now have this report to help us connect all these dots. So again, bravo for Food and Water Watch for putting all this together. And back to you.
Thank you for sharing your plethora of knowledge with us, Sandra. So I wanted to give folks a quick reminder that we will be emailing this recording of the webinar out. So in addition to any additional resources we cover. So, and also if you have any questions, be sure to type them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So next up, we will be hearing from Oakley about the new Fracking Endgame report.
Hello, and thanks to everybody who's joining. I'm Oakley Shelton Thomas, a researcher with Food and Water Watch, and tonight I will be giving you a brief overview of our new report, Fracking Endgame, Locked into Plastics, Pollution, and Climate Chaos. So frackers, basically, they've produced more gas than they know what to do with. And in order to raise prices, as well as lock in both current and even increased levels of production, big oil needs new outlets to absorb their products. So this means petrochemical facilities and gas-fired power plants to turn that gas into sellable products, while liquefaction facilities will allow gas producers to sell their product into new overseas markets. And every new facility locks in more fracking, more pipelines, and it neuters efforts that are needed to avoid climate chaos by actually transitioning to 100% renewable energy that's backed up by storage technology. So shale gas production has surged across the country, and in recent years, production has especially grown in and around Texas and Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, that's driven by the Marcellus and Utica shale plays, and in Texas, there's a lot of growth that has been in the Permian, where producers actually have so much extra gas that they're producing alongside the oil that they're actually burning or venting the gas as opposed to trying to sell it on the market. So that sort of just shows you how much of a gas glut that they have produced themselves into. And these regional trends are pretty important because a substantial amount of the infrastructure that's slated to be developed is planned to specifically take advantage of these regional plays and to extract more gas from them. So there's like a very clear link there. So all signs are pointing towards more fracking on the horizon and increased natural gas production. As much as $84 billion every year is sunk into new fracking investments. And the Department of Energy projects that gas production could grow by nearly a third by 2025. By 2040, US shale production, driven by fracking, could double. And of course, these projections all assume that the new end uses do come online, but it's a very frightening picture if that sort of industry projection that they want to happen does end up happening. So Frack gas production grew 15-fold between 2000 and 2018 to an average of 56.3 billion cubic feet per day. And all this fracking has broadly driven a substantial increase in overall natural gas production. However, real natural gas prices are at the lowest level in decades. They're 60% lower than where they were in about 2006, 2007. And while the graph might look like good news for the industry, it actually doesn't, because these low prices are eating into the producers' profits. What frackers want is both the overproduction and the prices of scarcity. They want to be able to sell more fracked gas at higher prices. And the only way to make that work is to boost their overall level of consumption, the overall level of consumption of natural gas, by boosting overall demand for products and by creating these new demand sources, these new end uses. So the new outlets are required to sustain production. It's the only way that frackers are going to be able to sell at higher prices. And the growth in demand primarily comes from electric power generators, industrial manufacturers, and increasingly now exporters. But in order to realize their production ambitions, frackers need to close the gap between supply and demand by building yet more dirty facilities. The growth in end uses has already enabled the fracking industry to grow and sustain itself. However, without yet more dirty end uses and facilities and infrastructure, fracking will be forced to slow. In the words of one industry proponent, without infrastructure, you have nothing. And this is why oil and gas companies are now cooperating on the creation of new markets to support production of their product, to support fracking. Many of the downstream investments are owned by vertically integrated conglomerates that also do fracking. So for example, or have some stake in the shale industry and in the upstream infrastructure. So for example, in November 2013, representatives of the oil, gas, petrochemical, and plastic industries convened a 3-day summit, which was the first of its kind, to address, quote, the opportunities and challenges of a coming renaissance in North American plastics. So they intend on cooperating about this. And some companies that are already engaging in this strategy include Exxon, which is building a $9.3 billion petrochemical facility in Corpus Christi, alongside the chemical company SABIC. And another example is Dominion Energy, which is a utility company that owns gas plants. They own an LNG terminal, and they also have some upstream infrastructure to benefit from that that's in the Marcellus and Utica shale. So they're going to make a lot of money off of every stage, and they're very dependent on continued extraction and fracking. So the first of the major outlets is petrochemical manufacturing. And petrochemical facilities turn natural gas and natural gas liquids into products like plastic, dyes, and rubber. According to the American Chemical Council, which is an industry association, the chemical industry is slated to spend $202 billion on 333 new facilities that are specifically to take advantage of shale gas. And a lot of that large-scale new investment in petrochemical capacity is flowing into places that have already seen a lot of it, like the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, where a huge number of petrochemical facilities and refineries emit substantial quantities of local air pollution with incredibly negative health effects, which has led to the moniker Cancer Alley for the region. One study found that rates of childhood leukemia were 56% higher for people living within 2 miles of the Houston Ship Canal, which is a hub for a lot of these petrochemical facilities, compared to people living just 10 miles from the canal. That's a really stark disparity. And the burden of all this local air pollution also falls on frontline communities, as these plants tend to be located near communities which are disproportionately lower income and disproportionately communities of color. At the corner of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, producers are aiming to make a second Gulf Coast by assembling as many as 9 production facilities, the biggest of which could produce up to 3.5 billion pounds of plastic every year. And if completed, the infrastructure would include pipelines, it would include like compressor stations and processing facilities. It means a lot more than just those facilities. And all this infrastructure would create a long-term market for fracking in the region, and would expand profits for drillers. The build-out could also be potentially backstopped by a $1.9 billion federal loan guarantee that is meant for clean energy, but the Department of Energy is directing towards a natural gas liquid storage facility too. So that means federal money is going towards dirty infrastructure, the opposite of the priorities that we need. And natural gas liquids, which I just mentioned, are an important part of the story too. So in addition to dry natural gas, methane, a byproduct as mentioned, of natural gas is natural gas liquids, or primarily ethane. And ethane is really common in certain shale plays, particularly the Marcellus. And these natural gas liquids are a key component of plastic and are behind the push to build an ever-increasing number of plastic facilities. And when you build plastic facilities, you get plastic. And plastic is pretty much the ultimate source of demand for fracking because so much of the plastic that is currently in use is already unnecessary, which essentially means that future growth in plastic doesn't necessarily have to be other necessary plastic. If what we now consume is unnecessary. Most plastic is already used for single-use products like packaging, which is thrown away immediately after use. And then only a small fraction of that plastic is ever recycled. And most ends up in the environment where it fragments. It fragments, it doesn't decompose. And during that process, it releases methane, it chokes wildlife, and it acts as a vehicle for toxic additives. Plastic is accumulating in a huge ocean trash heaps and is generally ending up everywhere. They found it in the lowest ocean trenches. And it has a serious toll on vital ocean ecosystems as well. Tiny plastic fragments called microplastics have been found in water supplies and consumer products ranging from everything to salt to like even beer they found microplastics in beer. And the added petrochemical capacity that's under construction, it would not only lock in the shale boom and fracking, but it's also projected to drive a 40% increase in plastic production over the next decade. So it means a huge amount of plastic too. The second outlet that frackers are looking for is exports. So while some gas can be exported via pipeline, there's pretty much an upper limit as to how much gas you can actually sell to like Canada and Mexico. So in order to get it across the ocean, it has to be chilled to negative 260 degrees and liquefied at really high pressure to be loaded onto these mega tankers that can then access new markets. And the process has a pretty large footprint with an array of dangerous consequences. Liquefying the gas itself is really energy intensive, so there's an environmental footprint to that. And then the process emits local air pollutants, which are dangerous for human health. And it's also associated with substantial methane leakage. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So the leakage associated not only with LNG, but with the rest of the fracked gas supply chain has serious climate consequences. Also, methane is super flammable, and when stored under high pressure, it's explosive. And when that's combined with super cool temperatures, which can make its storage a little bit tricky and potentially fickle weather, there's a real risk of catastrophic accidents that could result in a very large fire and explosion. And thankfully in the United States, we've only had some close calls, but there was a really, really bad LNG explosion in 2004 in Algeria. And hopefully that is not in our future if we commit to LNG exports. And hopefully we can stop them, obviously, too. So the LNG boom also contradicts this geopolitical justification that we once upon a time heard for fracking. Originally, fracking was pitched as necessary to secure domestic supplies and to lower consumer prices, which ironically, now that domestic prices are low, we also still do import some energy though. Frackers want to export gas in order to raise prices and more rapidly extract from the reserves. LNG exports, in effect, just supercharge the fracking boom. One economic analysis found that 80% of all exported gas will come from newly fracked wells. So if we want real energy independence, the solution is not exports and it's not fracking, it's renewable energy. Since 2016, when the first LNG export terminal came online, export capacity has been surging. It expanded rapidly to 3.6 billion cubic feet per day. So for context, that's about 5% of total US gas production. And that number even now is out of date. They're saying that it's projected to triple to about 10 billion cubic feet per day sometime around 2020. This map shows that rapid expansion. It's our analysis of the federal permit pipeline for liquefaction facilities. And as of about late 2018, there were 44 LNG projects that were either approved or pending federal approval. And it's very likely that many of them, they're pushing to get them approved. So if exporters do get their way, exports could potentially expand to 30 billion cubic feet per day by 2040, which would represent 25% of gas production. And it's rare that we can say this, but that's an even bigger number than it sounds because total gas production in that 2040 world where they do exports is going to be much higher than it is now. So an LNG boom has also been aided by federal promotion and sweetheart tax deals. That's what's letting this happen, not just like free market forces. The first company to export LNG, Cheniere, had limited experience with dangerous energy infrastructure, but they had a lot of ins with prominent federal officials. So not only was Cheniere first out the gate to export LNG, but they also received $1.6 billion in tax offsets from Louisiana to help them do it. The third outlet that's propping up fracking is electric power plants. Power plants now burn twice as much gas as they did 20 years ago. And as we can see, the colossal build out of natural gas plants has coincided with the fracking boom. This map shows a decade of gas plant openings, scaled by size, and the shale plays that have symbiotically enabled their construction. Going forward, the boom is likely to continue. Between 2018 and 2022, the Energy Information Administration projects that as many as 364 new gas-fired generators are going to open and start burning natural gas, all supporting fracking. So they're going to require pipeline infrastructure to do this. They're going to support fracking, and that's all going to happen for the decades that they remain in operation. If you look at the current fleet of natural gas power plants, you can see that plants that were built 50 years ago are still in operation today. And there's no reason to think that modern plants, their economic lifetime is not even potentially longer than that. So the companies building these plants today have the long term in mind, and they certainly don't plan on closing them in the time frame necessary to meet climate requirements. So building this infrastructure now creates a huge amount of infrastructure that's either going to have to get stranded, and that's going to be huge economic loss, or it locks us into a really dangerous climate future. Gas plants serve not one, but actually two functions for frackers. The first, obviously, they prop up fracking. They consume a ton of gas and they raise prices. But the second is that they allow gas producers to pitch themselves as a climate solution and natural gas as a bridge fuel. And they do that by claiming that fracking closes coal plants. So to dispel that myth, this graph here is from the Energy Information Administration's latest assessment of electricity markets. And it shows two worlds. And while neither scenario is sufficient to address the threat posed by climate change, you can see in the world where there's low oil and gas, so maybe there's not as much fracking, there's direct competition between renewables and natural gas, not between coal and natural gas, between renewables and natural gas, because as we were saying earlier, renewable technology is caught up, it's economically competitive, and coal is sort of out of the picture. So the supposed switch between natural gas and coal ignores the ability for clean renewables, which are backed up by other technologies like storage, their ability to replace and displace fossil fuels. So that's even ignoring the substantial leaks of methane from the fracked gas supply chain, which I mentioned earlier, which more than overwhelm any potential carbon dioxide benefits when the gas is burned, because if the methane is released to the atmosphere, it offsets that, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and we're increasingly learning that it's being released in quantities that are dangerous and unsustainable. So that means essentially there's no rationale for building natural gas plants. If we're really a bridge as fracking boosters were claiming all along, then now would be the time to end the bridge, because renewable technology is ready to go. So there's no reason to keep having the bridge fuel. So all that's pretty depressing, but we can win. Even with climate change looming, it is critical that we transition to 100% clean renewable energy by 2035. And the threat is daunting, but we can make big changes. And that's because already public sentiment on fracking has been changing. Polls show that more people oppose fracking than support it. We can also change public sentiment on natural gas and on the issue of petrochemicals and plastics through people like you that joined this call. And that means doing education campaigns, grassroots organizing, and putting pressure on elected officials to make the necessary policy changes and more. It's important to remember that people power works. We can win, we have won, we've won many times before. And it's because of grassroots activists like you that fracking has been banned in several states and fossil fuel infrastructure across the country has been shut down. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oakley, for that awesome presentation. So next, we're going to kick it off to Andrea, one of Food and Water Watch's organizers.
Hey everyone, thanks Oakley for that awesome presentation. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is to hone in on the petrochemical build out in Appalachia. So Hurricane Harvey really scared a lot of the petrochemical industry down along the Gulf Coast. So they've been really thinking about how to move their petrochemical activities inland. So they've set their sights on Appalachia. So like Oakley said, this is Western Pennsylvania, Southeast Ohio, West Virginia, and possibly parts of Kentucky. So this is where the Marcellus and Utica shales are located. And so the industry is trying to create a whole nother plastics hub around the glut of shale gas from the aggressive fracking push. So fracking that has already been negatively impacting communities for years now is now about to get a lot worse as the plastics industry moves in to create more pollution and more single-use plastic. And all of this is in an area that has historically been a place where healthy economic development has been overlooked. So we're really looking at a second Cancer Alley. This planned complex is going to be made up of a lot of different infrastructure, like ethane cracker plants, storage facilities, pipelines, and all kinds of things that Oakley has already mentioned. Some of these are already in construction, others are in the process of being planned, but one linchpin piece of infrastructure that we've been looking at is the Appalachia Storage and Trading Hub. We've been calling this the Petro Hub, and it recently applied for a $1.9 billion federal loan guarantee from the Department of Energy that Oakley mentioned. This really just means that if the project defaults, the government, aka taxpayers like you and I, would actually have to step in and pay back the private investors. So this money is really meant for clean energy projects, but oil and gas are claiming that fracking is a new technology. And so this is eligible for that loan guarantee. And we really can't let them get away with that, especially when the climate crisis is worsening by the day. So we believe that if we can block this financial backing, we can stop private investment and stop the build out from fully manifesting. So what we've done this year to try and stop this is through a congressional process. So to use an amendment on a bill to close this loophole that allows this kind of financial support for things that ostensibly are definitely not clean or renewable energy. So Representative Ilhan Omar and Representative Pramila Jayapal introduced this amendment for us that would stop the oil and gas industry from getting financial backing for projects that are masquerading as clean energy products. So we totally went to work, and activists rallied outside of their reps' offices. We had Food and Water Watch supporters and our allies calling their representatives every day. We were sending emails, and volunteers were really driving all of this outreach forward. So we worked with a ton of organizations and people, and amazingly, we were able to pass this through the House last month, which is a huge deal. It's a huge step, and now we're moving to push it through the Senate, which is going to be a really big battle. So this, along with many other grassroots fight, is one way to cut all of this off at the root in Appalachia. So we know that as organizers that we're gonna have to fight tooth and nail at every level, from local, state to federal, to stop projects like these. And it's really because lives are at risk, not just in Appalachia, but obviously all around the world, because all of this fossil fuel activity is really accelerating the climate disaster. So tentacles of this monster are really sort of everywhere. So you can definitely find a piece of infrastructure to fight on in whatever state that you live in. So we've got a link where you can send a message to your representative to ban fracking, but also keep an eye out for action alerts from us here at Food and Water Watch when we move our amendment fight into the Senate. We'll need everyone demanding their senator to stand up to projects like the Appalachian Petro Hub. So can't wait to work with you all to fight all of this really, really nasty stuff, because we know that we can win. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea. Quick reminder to folks on the webinar, we are going to be emailing this recording out and any additional resources we cover. Next, I'm going to be turning it over to Matt from Food and Water Watch.
Thanks so much, Allison, and thanks everyone for joining tonight's conversation. Again, my name is Matt Smith. I'm a senior organizer for Food and Water Watch here in New Jersey, and have spent the better part of the last 10 years fighting fossil fuel infrastructure here. And I just want to start by acknowledging that while there are many commonalities in our struggles against fossil fuel development, each project is also very unique. And so our strategies, messaging, and tactics to stop these projects have to account for the varied politics of the areas in which we're organizing, the different kinds of localized and regional impacts each project creates, and of course the different regulatory approval systems that exist across our different states. Here in New Jersey, we are situated directly between the Marcellus shale fields in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and key markets in the Northeast, as well as markets for exporting gas offshore. So as a result, we've really seen a lot of infrastructure development and proposed projects over the past decade. There are currently 12 major fossil fuel projects proposed in the state, and there are 3 that are currently under construction. These projects include pipelines, compressor stations, power plants, and recently proposed LNG export terminal here on the Delaware River. I wanted to share just a couple of our current campaigns against individual projects in the hope that maybe there's some valuable lessons that can be shared out or commonalities that can be identified with projects that you might be fighting or seeing in your communities. So one of the particular projects that we're fighting is proposed by a company, Williams. They're one of the largest pipeline companies in the country, and they're proposing a new pipeline to transport even more fracked gas from Pennsylvania through New Jersey and eventually into the Rockaways in New York. And we recently had a precedent-setting win here in New Jersey. We had been fighting this project on both sides of the Hudson River, our team in New York as well as our team in New Jersey. And in New York, they had actually had success previously in targeting Governor Cuomo with a very specific demand to use his authority to enforce the Clean Water Act to reject new fossil fuel projects. And so there was a big coalition win a few years ago against the Constitution pipeline that really established this precedent nationally of governors taking action to block interstate, federally approved fossil fuel projects. And so we recently sort of mirrored that strategy in this fight against this pipeline proposed through parts of central New Jersey and the Raritan Bay into New York. And we were able to pressure our governor, Democratic Governor Phil Murphy, for the first time to use, where a New Jersey governor used their authority to block a federally approved interstate gas pipeline project. And that was just last month that we won that decision. Now, of course, the decision is temporary. The company is already reapplying, and we'll come back and we'll have to fight them and beat them again. But I think what really helped us in that fight was finding a critical choke point, a point of vulnerability where not only we had a concrete decision that could impact the viability of the project, namely the governor's decision to either approve or reject this Clean Water Act permit, but also a target that we felt we had some degree of influence over. The other thing we did really well in this particular fight was build a big tent coalition. We not only organized with other environmental groups and some of our common allies in these fights, but we really got to the neighborhood level and really, engaged in open conversations with homeowners along the pipeline route, around the compressor stations, even people who made their living fishing in the Raritan Bay who really were under threat of losing their very livelihood right out from under them. In the event this pipeline would be approved and move forward. So I think really building a big tent coalition and setting our sights on the long haul. This was a near 3-year-long campaign. So we really need to account for the long nature, and it's not even over because they're reapplying. So we need to build up front for the full length of these campaigns. One of the other projects that we're currently battling is a massive new frack gas power plant in the New Jersey Meadowlands. This project would also send 100% of its electricity to New York. And we really, for lack of a better word, capitalized on that. Oftentimes, I think what motivates you or I to fight these projects, namely, climate catastrophe or increased fracking, might not be what motivates the average homeowner who could be living within the direct pollution plume of a major new fossil fuel facility. So I think what we did successful early was really just talk to people about the project and really listen to them and hear from them what their concerns were. And so we did a ton of door-to-door canvassing, street leafleting, talking to people in the parks around the power plant, going door-to-door, circulating petitions. The other thing we did was set up a distributed organizing campaign where we set up local activist hubs in every town around the plant here in New Jersey, where it's a very dense population. That was quite a few towns. And even with just a couple of people in each town, we were able to successfully organize public educational forums, build constituencies to go to their local town council, pass resolutions against the project. And to date, we've passed a total of 52 municipal resolutions against the project. And that really set the stage for then state legislators to get on board and also oppose, and really sort of starting from the ground level and building our way up. And the other thing we did really well in that campaign was engage youth leadership. I think we're in a unique moment now where more and more young people are identifying climate change and fossil fuels as the defining issue of their future. But many are unsure of or lack opportunities to actually get engaged in meaningful work and have real on-ramps to develop their own leadership skills. So I think what was important for us is to really take the time to outreach to schools, contact principals and teachers, put up billboards in frontline communities, and really put it out there that we were looking to establish these connections. And, you know, we went to dozens of schools, gave presentations, talked to students and student environmental clubs, gave even full school assemblies. And, you know, it's not like they rolled out the red carpet for us. We did have to sort of bang the doors down to get in there, but it definitely paid off when a couple of months ago, we were able to engage hundreds of youth in a youth-led march against the power plant that was incredibly successful. And the result of all these efforts is the project has been delayed since November, due in no small part to the intense political pressure that we've put on the governor here in New Jersey. And then lastly, I would say that one of the things we've done recently is, even just with our best organizing strategies, tactics, messaging, it's simply impossible to fight the number of projects that we're currently facing one-off. So we actually united all of the communities and organizations who are fighting unique fossil fuel projects in our state. It's about 15 projects behind a common demand for the governor to implement a moratorium. Really what we want is a full permanent ban, but we felt the moratorium was a more winnable demand in the short term that would also set up and build political power for the longer demand to ban new fossil fuel infrastructure permanently and transition more rapidly to 100% renewables. And so, you know, one of the key things we did was we defined the cumulative greenhouse gas impacts, the cumulative air pollution impacts from all of the dozen plus projects proposed in New Jersey, and then again linked up all of the organizations and communities to make a unified demand for a moratorium. And that took years worth of work, sort of building those relationships across communities and across different fights. But we are starting to see real dividends in terms of the pressure. And we think that united front is what helped push Governor Murphy to reject the latest big pipeline proposal that was set for a permit before his administration. So I'll pause there and pass it back to Allison.
Thanks, Matt. That was really important and inspiring information. So thank you for sharing. So next, we're going to head up to do some Q&A on the webinar. But before we get to that, I want to mention that we're going to be circulating a ban fracking petition to those of you who have joined. It'll allow for us to call on people to engage in local, statewide, and national issues in the future if you sign on. So with that, let's we've had many people submit questions to us. So we tried to pick some of these to answer here, and I'll do this first one for Oakley. So Oakley, you mentioned earlier how the build out of these planned and proposed facilities will have an effective lifespan for far longer than the point by which experts agree we should shed all fossil fuels, meaning that these are going to be stranded assets and wasted economic investments. Do you have thoughts on how we can avoid stranded assets in the future?
Yeah, so the key way to avoid stranded assets is to not build them now. If we build them now, they are effectively stranded because they need to be closed long before they're going to be able to turn a profit. So that means that building these new infrastructure, the facilities, the end usage, as well as all of the infrastructure that supports that broader build out, is just creating this huge financial bubble that's going to have to be popped when we pass real climate legislation that closes these facilities before they operate to the point where they're expected to pay off all their debt. This is important to emphasize too, is that even if they do somehow operate, and this would be very dangerous to their like economically anticipated lifetime, even climate change is going to start impinging on their economic viability. And this is not like a hypothetical scenario. We saw in Hurricane Harvey in Houston, lots of the chemical facilities, the very petrochemical facilities that are powering fracking and that are powering climate change were swamped with water, and that the rising sea levels and the flooding and the extreme weather is going to undermine these investments. So from any perspective, it doesn't make any economic sense or any fiscal sense to build these now.
Thank you for that. So actually this tailspins perfectly into another question that's kind of closely related. Matt, I'm going to ask this to you first, and then I'll probably ping you later, Andrea, to see if you have anything to add on. So Matt, my question for you here is, what are some effective grassroots organizing strategies for stopping fossil fuel infrastructure projects?
Yeah, thanks, Allison. I mean, I think I kind of touched on maybe one or two of these in talking through the campaigns, but there are three, major lessons that I wanted to share. First of all, I think we're in a new moment politically in our fight against fossil fuel infrastructure. Even just a few years ago, we were not seeing the kinds of people who previously weren't coming out to our events, our educational forums, really stepping forward and wanting to get more engaged. And so I think we just need to, think about pitching bigger coalition tents, and really reaching out to uncommon allies, and really working to build popular support around our campaigns and issues. And that could be done in a number of different ways. The beauty of it is that, so many people have so many different networks and skills and connections. And I think as organizers and activists, it's really our job to find meaningful ways for folks to plug into the work that utilizes their skills and networks and unique connections, and really redefining the playing field in which we organize politically to stop these projects. The other thing I think that's critically important is that we find decision makers at the local, county, and state level and pressure them to use whatever authority they have to stop new fossil fuel infrastructure projects. And so a lot of times that takes research, it takes an understanding of local intermediate and state level law and regulatory authority. But that upfront work in finding a target that we think we have at least more influence over, certainly more than a federal agency who's, perhaps never been more unaccountable under the current administration, is really key, because we can't rely on agencies like FERC to stop these projects. We have to find viable targets and viable permits that we think we can stop and build political power around stopping them. And then I think the last piece is just around linking our fights together behind a common demand. So, in certain areas where it's more rural, less populated in New Jersey, I know that we don't often associate New Jersey with that kind of demographic, but there are out there, and they are too facing pipeline projects. They simply don't really have the strength and numbers to bring meaningful political pressure to bear on our governor here to reject a key permit. Whereas in North Jersey, where there's hundreds of thousands of people living within 5 to 10 miles of the proposed power plant, I think it's critical that we work to unite rural and suburban and urban communities behind shared and common demands, and build political power together to win our campaigns.
Awesome, that makes sense. So that was a really comprehensive answer. Andrea, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but if you do you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I just want to reiterate that all of that I am totally on board with, and so you should definitely run with that. Yeah, and I think the other thing that we think about a lot is how do these different scales work together, and also who can we run like in electoral campaigns that are really going to stand firm on our issues. So that's just one other sort of like a way to think about how this year and next year are going to be really important in this fight.
So my other question, I guess a lot of the organizing insights that you guys provided would apply to this answer. So I'm going to direct it to Oakley in this instance, just to kind of get his research perspectives on it. Do you have thoughts or ideas on how to convince states to invest in more renewable energy?
So I think the research angle can be helpful here for states that might be pretty recalcitrant, especially in a world where there's not federal support and we don't have pressure over federal actors. the linkage between the supply of fossil fuel and then these end uses, if we're able to stop sort of the supply at various points, whether that means pipelines, whether it means actual bans on fracking or restrictions on fracking waste in other states, those actions have knock-on effects in states that maybe aren't investing in renewable energy that will encourage them to do so. But I want to emphasize here that it's not necessarily that the knock-on effects are from the ban, but the bans themselves or the supply restrictions really are the main point, because renewable energy is important because it enables us to restrict fossil fuel access and stop burning them, but it's not an end in and of itself. It just enabled us to do that. So we could have a world where we generated 100% of our electricity from renewable energy, but if we still allowed exports and we shipped all our fracked gas overseas and turned a lot of it into plastics and had these dirty petrochemical facilities, we would still have a climate crisis on our hands. So without stopping the infrastructure and stopping the supply, investing in renewable energy isn't enough, but it is important. And you can link those two things together.
Sandra, I was wondering, do you have anything to add to any of these questions that we have asked? It can be any one of them. Any thoughts or insights you'd like to provide?
Well, I just think that people should be aware that this methane surge that we're experiencing right now is being driven by fracking. So just to kind of underscore what was just said, that renewables and the fight for renewables is necessary but not sufficient, right? And there's still scientific debate about all the relative contributions to this surge of methane that we're seeing in the atmosphere. It may be driven by climate change itself feeding more warming, right? Insofar that swamps and wetlands, especially in the tropics, may be releasing more methane as they warm. But of all the drivers of climate, of the methane surge, including ruminants and livestock, the one that we have control over is fracking. So whether it ends up being 10% of the problem, 30% of the problem, or 80% of the problem, and we in the scientific community are still trying to figure that all out, it's the lever that we have that we know, because methane is such a powerful greenhouse gas, it would buy us time to solve the rest of the problem. So whatever we can do to leave the methane in the ground is what has to happen, whether the end use is petrochemicals, LNG, or burning it in gas-fired power plants to keep the light on at home. All of those end uses have to stop for us to meaningfully address climate.
Thanks, Sandra. Those are some really good points. So as you guys can see, there are many actions that we can take to address these issues, including working in our communities to stop fracking and other infrastructure projects, restricting the sale of plastic products that prop up the oil and gas industry. So it's clear from listening to our speakers that we, instead of doubling down on new fossil fuel facilities, we need to invest in clean, renewable energy. Technology for a large-scale transition to renewable energies has existed for over 20 years. We just need the strong government policies backed by political will to see it through. So we're encouraged to see that there is a movement for broad transformative change through, for example, the Green New Deal. But the Green New Deal resolution, though ambitious, does not directly address the massive fracking and fossil fuel build-out that we've discussed tonight. Members of Congress need to hear from you, and they need to be told to act right away to shut down fracking and plastics, to shut down power plants, to shut down petrochemical facilities, LNG expansion, before it locks us into unavoidable climate chaos. You can call your members of Congress and sign up to get mobile alerts from us on key issues like banning fracking and the Appalachian Storage Hub that we heard about earlier by going to our mobile list. So get a pen out right now. We just need you to text the word frack to the number 69866. That's FRACK to 69866. You can also get involved through our central volunteer teams and connect with our state offices by going to our website at foodandwaterwatch.org. So in closing, I just want to thank all of our amazing speakers, as well as all of you who joined and our allies and our partners who shared this webinar with their networks. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight, this evening. We couldn't do any of the work that we're doing without an incredible network of advocates and activists like you all. So have a wonderful evening, and thanks again for joining.